That he had been several hundred years in the spirit world could be seen by the few tattered remnants of his garb, which bespoke a former age, and he had spent the greater part of his earth life inflicting mental and physical tortures upon those who had the misfortune to come into his evil clutches. Every crime that he had committed against other people had, at last, reverted to and descended upon him. He now had before him, he had done so for hundreds of years, the memory, the indelible memory of every act of evil he had perpetrated against his fellows. When he was upon earth, he had acted under a false pretense of administering justice. In very truth, his justice had been nothing but a travesty, and now he was seeing exactly what true justice really meant. Not only was his own life of wickedness continually before him, but the features of his many victims were ever passing before his mind, creating out of that same memory which is registered unfailingly and irredactably upon the subconscious mind. He cannot ever forget, he must always remember, and his condition was aggravated by the anger of feeling like a trapped animal. We stood together, a little group of three, but we could not feel one tiny vestige of sympathy for this inhuman monster. He aroused none within us. He was receiving his just merits, no more, no less. He had judged himself and condemned himself, and now he was suffering the punishment he had solely and entirely inflicted upon himself. Here was no case of an avenging God inflicting appropriate punishment upon a sinner. The sinner was there, truly, but he was the visible manifestation of the unutterable law of cause and effect. The cause was in his earthly life. The effect was in his spiritual life, his spirit life. Had we been able to detect one tiny glimmer of that light, it is a real light that we see, which is an unmistakable sign of spiritual stirrings within, we might have done something for this soul. As it was, we could do nothing but hope that one day this dreadful being would call for help in true earnestness and sincerity. His call would be answered unfailingly. We turned away, and Edwin led us down through an opening in the rocks on to more or less level ground. We could see at once that this part of the crater was more thickly peopled, if one can use the term people, of such as we saw there. The inhabitants were variously occupied. Some were seated upon small boulders and gave every appearance of conspiring together, but upon what devilish schemes it was impossible to say. Others were in small groups perpetuating unspeakable tortures upon the weaker of their kind, who must in some fashion have fallen foul of their tormentors. Their shrieks were unbearable to listen to, and so we closed our ears to them, firmly and effectively. Their limbs were indescribably distorted and malformed, and in some cases their faces and heads had retrograded to the merest mockery of a human countenance. Others again we observed to be lying prone upon the ground as though exhausted from undergoing torture, or because of expending their last remaining energy upon inflicting it, before they could gather renewed strength to recommence their barbarities. Interspersed throughout the great area of this dreadful region were pools of some sort of liquid. It looked thick and viscid and inexpressibly filthy, as indeed it was. Edwin told us that the stench that came from these pools was in keeping with all else that we had seen there, and he advised us earnestly not to dream of testing the matter for ourselves. We followed his advice implicitly. We were horrified to see signs of movement in some pools, and we guessed, without Edwin having to tell us, that frequently the inhabitants slip and fall into them. They cannot drown because they are indestructible as we are ourselves. We witnessed all manner of bestialities and grossness, and such barbarities and cruelties as the mind can scarcely contemplate. It is not my purpose nor my wish to give you a detailed account of what we beheld. We had by no means reached the bottom of the foul pit, but I have given you quite sufficient details of what is to be found in the realms of darkness. And now you will ask, how does this all come about? How or why are such places allowed to exist? Perhaps the matter will become clearer when I tell you that every soul who lives in those awful places once lived upon the earth plane. The thought is dreadful, but the truth cannot be altered. Do not think for one moment that I have exaggerated in my brief description of these regions. I assure you that I have not done so. I have, in fact, given you an understatement. The whole of these revolting regions exists by virtue of the same laws that govern the states of beauty and happiness. The beauty of the spirit world is the outward and visible expression of the spiritual progression of its inhabitants. When we have earned the right to possess things of beauty, they are given to us through the power of creation. In this sense, we can be said to have created them ourselves. Beauty of mind and deed can produce nothing but beauty, and hence we have flowers of heavenly beauty, trees and meadows, rivers and streams, and seas of pure, glistening, crystal clear water, magnificent buildings for the joy and benefit of us all, and our own individual homes where we can surround ourselves with still more beauty and enjoy the delights of happy converse with our fellows. But ugliness of mind and deed can produce nothing but ugliness. The seeds of hideousness sown upon the earth plane will inevitably lead to the reaping of a harvest of hideousness in the spirit world. These dark realms have been built up by the people of the earth plane, even as they have built up the realms of beauty. No single soul is forced into either the realms of light or those of darkness. No soul could possibly take exception to anything he found in his realm of light, since discontent or disapproval, discomfort or unhappiness cannot exist in these realms. We are a supremely happy, united body of people, and we live together in complete harmony. No soul should, therefore, feel out of place. The denizens of the realms of darkness have, by their lives on earth, condemned themselves, each and every one, to the state in which they now find themselves. It is the inevitable law of cause and effect, as sure as night follows day upon the earth plane. Of what avail to cry for mercy? The spirit world is a world of strict justice, a justice that cannot be tampered with, a justice which we are all met out to ourselves. Strict justice and mercy cannot go together. However wholeheartedly and sincerely we may forgive the wrong that has been done to us, mercy is not given to us to dispense in the spirit world. Every bad action must be accounted for by the one who commits it. It is a personal matter which must be done alone, even as the actual event of death of the physical body must be gone through alone. No one can do it for us, but by the great dispensation upon which this and all worlds are founded, we can and do have ready and able assistance in our tribulation. Every soul who dwells in these dreadful dark realms has the power within him to rise up out of the foulness into the light. He must make the individual effort himself. He must work out his own redemption. None can do it for him. Every inch of the way he must toil himself. There is no mercy awaiting him, but stern justice. But the golden opportunity of spiritual reclamation is ready and waiting. He has but to show an earnest desire to move himself one fraction of an inch toward the realms of light that are above him, and he will find a host of unknown friends who will help him towards his heritage, which is his due, but which in his folly he cast aside. Some first impressions. To find one suddenly transformed into a permanent inhabitant of the spirit world is, at first, an overwhelming experience. However much one may have read about the conditions of life in the world of spirit, there still remains an almost illimitable number of surprises in store for every soul. Those of us who have returned to earth to tell about our new life are faced with the difficulty of trying to describe, in terms of the earth, what is essentially of a spirit nature. Our descriptions must fall short of the reality. It is difficult to conjure up in the mind a state of beauty greater than we have ever experienced upon earth, magnified by 100 times the beauties that I have told you about, and you would still be far short of a true appraisement. A question, therefore, that might come into the minds of not a few people would perhaps be this: what was it that struck you most forcibly and most pleasurably when you first arrived in the spirit world? And what were your first impressions? Let me place myself in the position of one seeking information and interview our old friends Edwin and Ruth. Edwin and I, as you will recall, were brother priests when we were on earth. Edwin had no knowledge whatever upon the subject of spirit return, beyond what I had tried to give him of my own experiences. He was one of the few who really sympathized with me in my psychic difficulties, one of the few, that is, who did not brandish Orthodox Church teachings in my face. He has since told me that he is very glad he did not do so. When he was on earth, the life to come was a complete mystery to him, as it unnecessarily is to many others. He naturally conformed to the Church's teachings, obeyed its commandments, performed his duties, and, as he has since quite frankly admitted, hoped for the best, whatever that best might be. But his earthly life had not consisted solely of religious exercises. He had helped others upon every occasion where help was needed and where he could possibly give it. Those services, unobtrusively performed, had helped him immeasurably when the time came for him to quit the earth world. Those kind actions brought him into the land of beauty and eternal sunshine. His first impressions upon his awakening in the spirit world were, to use his own words, absolutely breathtaking. He had visualized, subconsciously perhaps, some sort of misty state as the condition of a future life, where there would be a great deal of prayer and praise. To find himself in a realm of inexpressible beauty, with all the glories of earthly nature purged of its earthliness, refined and eternalized, with the enormous wealth of color all around and about him. To behold the crystal purity of the rivers and the brooks, with the charm of the country dwellings and the grandeur of the city temples and halls of learning. To find himself in the center of all such glories, without an inkling of what had thus been in store for him, was to cast doubts upon the veracity of his own eyes. He could not believe that he was not in the midst of some beautiful but fantastic dream, from which he would shortly awaken, to find himself once again in his old familiar surroundings. He thought how he would relate this dream when he returned to consciousness. Then he considered how it would be received, as very beautiful, no doubt, but just a dream. And so he stood gazing upon all this wealth of beauty. That, Edwin said, was his first and greatest impression. He had regarded as part of the same dream all that had gone before it, all that had led up to his standing and gazing in wonder upon the scene that stretched out almost unendingly before him. How he had awakened upon a comfortable couch in a very charming house, to see sitting beside him an old friend, who performed the same office for Edwin as did Edwin for me when he came to meet me. His friend led him out of doors to see the new world. Then came his friend's most difficult task, to convince Edwin that he had died and yet still lived. You see, at first he took his friend and his friend's explanation to be part of the same dream, and he was nervously awaiting for something to happen that would break up the dream into returning earthly consciousness. Edwin admitted that he took some convincing, but his friend was infinitely patient with him. The instant that he was assured that he was really and truly and permanently in the world of spirit, his heart knew no greater joy, and he proceeded to do what I afterwards did in company with Ruth, travel through the lands of the new life with the luxurious freedom of body and mind that is of the very essence of spirit life in these realms. What most impressed Ruth upon her first awakening in the spirit world was, she said, the enormous profusion of color. Her transition had been a placid one, and she had consequently awakened after a brief sleep calmly and gently. As with Edwin, she had then found herself in a delightful house, small, neat, and compact, and all her own. An old friend was beside her, ready to help in the inevitable perplexities that accompany so many awakenings in the spirit world. Ruth is by nature rather reserved, especially, as she said, when it came to talking about herself. In Edwin's case, I knew so much of his earth life that it was easy for me to draw upon my own knowledge of him. Ruth, however, I had never seen until we met here upon this occasion beside the lake. After much persuasion, I managed to extract from her one or two details concerning her earthly life. She had never, she said, been an active church-goer, not because she despised the church, but because her own views upon the hereafter did not agree with what her own church taught. She saw too much of faith required and too little of fact being given. And altogether she had encountered so much of the troubles and afflictions of others in her daily life that the vague but rather terrifying picture of the world to come, the dreadful judgment day that was so constantly held before her in the church teachings, she instinctively felt to be wrong. The emphasis laid so strongly upon the word sinner was the almost wholesale condemnation of everyone as such. She also felt to be wrong. She was not foolish enough, she declared, to believe that we are all saints, but at the same time we are not all sinners. Of the many people she knew, she could recall none who could ever be so branded and condemned in the religious sense. Where then were all these people going after they had died? She could never imagine herself sitting in judgment upon these souls and passing sentence upon them as sinners. It would be preposterous to contemplate, Ruth added, that she could be more merciful than God. It was unthinkable. So she had built up for herself a simple faith, a practice that the theologian would at once say was highly dangerous and never for one moment to be encouraged. He would have spoken of the peril in her which her immortal soul stood by entertaining such ideas. But Ruth never for an instant considered her immortal soul to be in peril. Indeed, she went happily along, living her life according to the dictates of her gentle nature, helping others in her daily life, and bringing a little sunshine into the drab lives of others. And she was firmly convinced that when her time came to leave the earth plane, she would take with her into the new life the affection of her many friends. She had no fear of death of the physical body, nor could she imagine it to be the terrifying experience that so many people anticipate and dread. She had no absolute grounds for this belief, and she had since concluded that she must have been drawn to it intuitively. Apart from the glorious colors of the realm in which she found herself, what struck Ruth very forcibly was the astonishing clearness of the atmosphere. There was nothing like it to be seen on earth. The atmosphere was so free from the slightest trace of mistiness, and her own vision seemed to be so intensified in power and extent, that the enormous range of colors became doubly vivid. She had a naturally keen eye for color, and she had undergone considerable musical training when she was upon earth. When she came into the spirit world, these two faculties had combined, and the color and music of the new land had burst upon her with all the luxuriance of their superb beauty. At first she could scarcely believe her senses, but her friends had soon explained to her just what had happened, and as she had so few fixed ideas about the future life, so had she so little to unlearn.